Now it is time for our first discussion. So, Allison, what happens if the party supporting Netanyahu gets 61 seats in this election?
Oh, the big question. Starting a few weeks ago, highway overpasses and busy city intersections in at least 150 spots around the country have once again been clogged by people holding flags and signs, many of them directly addressing former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, reading, "You will not return," meaning that you will not be reelected prime minister. Driving home from my brother's house, it was just like really a parade of the bridges, one after another. It was amazing. The protesters say that they are committed to, quote, safeguarding a free and democratic Israel, and that they are terrified for the fate of the country if Netanyahu returns to running the government. You hear this kind of thing a lot these days. It's a theme that is sounded often by politicians in what is known as the anyone but Bibi camp. Last week, recently retired IDF Chief of Staff and number 2 in Benny Gantz's National Unity Party, Gadi Eisenkot, said in a long interview in Haaretz that Netanyahu's re-election would lead to chaos and violence in both Israel and the occupied territories. Eisenkot said that Netanyahu would establish a, quote, coalition of racism, violence, and incitement. Such a thing dismantles a society. He said that the extreme governing coalition Netanyahu would assemble will be unable to implement a carrot and stick policy towards Palestinians, and the all stick and more stick and lots of stick approach it will take will foment death and ruin for Palestinians and, as a result, also for Israelis. Netanyahu will strengthen Hamas and Palestinian radicals and rejectionists, Eisenkot said, and he said that Netanyahu will also tank Israel's improving relations with America and Europe. He will further gum things up with Iran. He would toady up to Putin rather than continuing to supply humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Eisenkot did not include in his list of concerns about Netanyahu's possible return to power any worry about his wish to weaken the Supreme Court, but many others have taken to calling that the greatest threat incumbent in a Netanyahu premiership. He also did not mention concessions that Netanyahu as prime minister would make to the ultra-Orthodox politicians who are probably his staunchest supporters. A few days ago, Haaretz ran an unsigned editorial headlined, "Netanyahu is the most serious threat to Israel's future," and the paper's editors seem to have in mind all of these factors taken together. They added that, quote, during Netanyahu's time in power, about 50 new outposts were added in the West Bank, and the settler population increased by 50% to more than 450,000, up from 300,000. They argue that this buildup in the territories is bound to return, maybe faster than ever, if Netanyahu returns. Haaretz Gadfly columnist Rogel Alfa wrote a column aptly headlined, "Just so there are no illusions, when Netanyahu comes back to power, he will be a dictator." Which may be hyperbolic, but still it seems to capture the fears of many of those who find themselves more and more worried and fearful as Election Day nears. We are just now 12 days ahead of the election. Time flies when we have lots of Jewish holidays. Don, what is reasonable to think? What will happen if the elections produce a coalition of parties eager for Benjamin Netanyahu to return to being Israel's prime minister?
Well, I don't want to rehash Eisenkot's or Haaretz's points, which I think most of which are legitimate. And I'm assuming we're talking about a coalition without Gantz's National Unity Party. Let's not forget that Netanyahu's number one objective is to terminate the criminal cases against himself. And that will be a first order of business for his new coalition. He has very wisely, we discussed it last week, toned down his anti-judicial rhetoric so as not to remind the public of these cases because, people forget about them. There's long gaps in between the actual convening of the court. And I think we shouldn't deceive ourselves that this is not foremost in his obsessive mind. Now, I think he will deliver a coalition that's likely to weaken the ability of the courts to cancel legislation passed by the Knesset. They've been talking about a bill, a new law to give the Knesset the ability to override judicial decisions which cancel legislation because they're in conflict with basic laws, the closest we have to a constitution. It's part of a bigger desire to weaken the balance of powers, to give more power to the prime minister and the Knesset. That is, so long as they're controlling the Knesset. Then then his coalition partners, the Haredim, are experiencing again, at least for this 1 year, what it's like to be out of power and not to have the immediate approval of the budgets that they usually demand. So I'm expecting, as Bibi promised them recently, in order to to get them back in his camp and not to agree, for instance, to adopt some of the core curriculum for their schools, which would help people eventually integrate more into the workforce. He offered them just unlimited budgets with no quid pro quo, as long as they support him. So I think the Haredim will move further away from integration into the Israeli work world. Now, then you look at his more extremist partners, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who were likely to be ministers. And they're not going to settle for portfolios that are mostly neutral, or nothing is completely neutral in this country, like transportation, like Mihrav Michaeli from Labor took.
And that Smotrich had before.
And Smotrich had before, and I'm not saying he didn't do a good job with that, but he's a very capable guy, which is what makes him so dangerous. But these guys are openly anti-Arab. They're openly homophobic. To some degree, I think they're also misogynist. We certainly know they hate leftists. So I think they can do damage to reverse policies favoring the LGBTQ community, maybe on the surrogates, maybe on other issues. Obviously, as you already mentioned, they'll undermine any move toward a Palestinian state. Not that that's been on the front burner in this country for a very long time, but Lapid just brought it back up and put it on the table at his UN address. So these guys are going to want to do everything they can to bury it. Will they move back to the annexation plan? Not impossible, especially if Trump comes back into office and if Bibi can mend fences with him. So one last thing, and I'm talking a long time already, they also, and Bibi has been talking about this as part of his campaign, they're against regulatory agencies. Regulatory agencies are there to rein in the greed of the corporate world to protect citizens, and they're arguing that these are unnecessary. Also, they're going to want to advance their own agendas in the territories, religion, and state. Lots and lots to worry about.
Yeah, I agree with fully with the last things you were talking about the religious Zionists, about Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the rest of them, how their agenda is fearsome, and how if they are the numbers, votes number 49 through 61 in this coalition, they'll have a great deal of power. This exercise of thinking through actually what it will be like if Netanyahu becomes prime minister was a big relief for me. I was glad to have done it, because it got me a little bit out of the Chicken Little sky is falling thing to think more specifically about Netanyahu himself. After the election, if it turns out that there are 61 seats of parties that support Netanyahu in the Knesset, in the upcoming Knesset, then the first thing that Netanyahu is going to try to do is to try to weaken the right wing by getting Benny Gantz to join his government. It's clear that Netanyahu does not want to rule with this far, far, far right coalition. His agenda has never been the same as that. I'm now deep into reading his autobiography, and it's very, very clear that he is cut of a very different cloth than those ideologues of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And in the past, despite what Haaretz said about how under his watch, the true thing that Haaretz said in its editorial about how under his watch the number of people defined as settlers, the number of settlers went up from 300,000 to 450,000 over those last 10 years. If you parse those numbers a little further, you see that of that 150,000 delta, something like 125,000 of them actually live within 1 kilometer of the Green Line. So it's not as big an issue as it seems.
Big ultra-Orthodox communities make up a big percentage.
Big ultra-Orthodox communities right near the border.
Right. Yep. Right.
So that reflects the fact that Netanyahu did not buy fully into the agenda and of the settlers who by the end of it,
he's never been their champion.
Right, and they support him because he's the best that they can get, but they also loathe him and criticize him very much. And so what we'll have is a Netanyahu who is like desperate to neutralize the power of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich from the moment that he is prime minister, which puts, by the way, and the topic is really Netanyahu, but the question that you raised immediately, Don, and rightly, is will Benny Gantz join a government with Netanyahu? And I, for the first time, thinking this through this week in preparation for this podcast, realized what a huge dilemma that guy faces. Like, I would not want to be Benny Gantz, because a government with him, a Netanyahu-led government with him in it, is a completely different and much better thing than a government without him in it. However, he cannot join a government with Netanyahu, but he cannot not join a government with Netanyahu. And so who Netanyahu is depends very much on Benny Gantz right now. But but I think that the fear that Netanyahu is just going to be, like Rogel Alfer said, a dictator is not true. I also, as somebody who actually supports most of the reforms that the Likud wants in the courts myself.
Can I just interrupt? It's funny because, ironically, if he was a dictator, he would be able to neutralize Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but he won't be able to because they're going to have so much power within his coalition.
That's
it's
right.
kind of like, oh, we wish he was a dictator, but he is not going to be a dictator.
And the biggest issue is the courts. I think that you're absolutely right, Don, that one of the first things that Netanyahu is going to try to do is to pass a law to make it no longer possible to prosecute a sitting prime minister, which he's spoken about before and clearly wants to have passed. And Smotrich, by the way, has already offered to table that law.
And to give immunity to all ministers so that Smotrich could do anything he wants.
Exactly. And so that seems very, very likely to happen. I personally think that law, which is similar to a law that they have in France and many other places, would be a good law to have. Which is to say, I don't think that necessarily correlates with dictatorship. But for people that think that would be terrible, that will likely happen, and their fears will come true. I just don't personally share that fear as an existential fear. I think that they're right, though, that will happen. Allison, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think that in this whole discussion of, gloom and doom, what would happen if Netanyahu comes to power, that every poll indicates that that's going to be a real problem for him to make happen unless there's this huge surprise at the polls. It doesn't look like he can cross 61 unless Mahmoud and Mansour, unless Mansour Abbas and the Ram Party join his coalition to put him over that number.
The latest poll by Channel 14 does give him 61 seats.
It does give him 61 seats, so
take that with a little grain of
yes,
salt.
Channel 14 is a right-wing channel. But the others give him 59, and this one gives him 61. So it is possible.
I mean, you alluded to the Arab vote, which I think is going to become crucial. It's a different part of the discussion, but that is on the rise, actually, and I'm expecting the Arab vote is going to be somewhat higher, I don't know if significantly higher, than what they've been anticipating, and that will become a factor, and also the Arab parties are aligned differently this year. So
for the sake of this discussion, we are asking the question, what will happen if he gets elected,
right.
which is possible.
Right.
I think that there's...
Okay, but it's also how he gets elected and how many votes Likud actually gets, how many votes, how strong this Smotrich Ben-Gvir party is. And I just think the most interesting scenario will be, because Abbas has said that he is willing to go with Bibi. He makes no bones about it. So the most fascinating, intellectually scenario will be if what stands between Bibi and 61 is going to be letting Ram in.
Then the government is Gantz and Mansour Abbas and the Likud. Because the religious Zionists will not.
That's not going to happen.
If he gets Gantz, he won't need Mansour Abbas. I'm more.
If he gets Gantz, but Gantz is not willing to sit with Ben-Gvir.
But the religious
then the government that he puts together is going to be Abbas, Gantz, and Netanyahu.
That is not going to happen. The religious Zionists are going to be in the government. Bibi needs them to pass the legislation he wants to protect himself.
True.
That is not legislation that Gantz's party is going to sign off on.
But Abbas might.
I don't know if Abbas would sign off on that either. But Abbas isn't going to have enough seats to make the difference. So he needs religious Zionism to meet his number one priority, which is to keep himself out of the courts, to keep himself. I don't think he's ever going to end up in prison in this country, but for him to not be disqualified from serving in office. And that's, I don't think we can get past that. I don't think there's a way around that.
I think that you're right, that the main thing, the most obvious and outstanding thing that is like truly fearsome and loathsome to many, many people, particularly on the left, lots of people in the center, is that he will he will try to pass a reform of the courts right away. And I think that it's very
Right.
likely, if he can form a government, that will happen.
And weaken the powers of the Attorney General, weaken anything that is
Right.
able to rein him in or to keep these cases going. So I think
It'll be the
it's-
save his
it's-
ass government.
Right, and look, I don't think it's impossible that Gantz would come into government even with religious Zionism. I mean,
No, he wouldn't.
I think anything's
way.
possible. He
No
promised, he
way.
promised, he promised, he promised, he promised, and he went in with Bibi last time.
I
So
know,
folks,
but once bitten, twice shy. Fool
Yeah,
me
no, I
once,
don't think he's.
fool me
I don't think he's
twice,
going to
yeah.
do that too. But I do think
Yeah.
that it's possible that he may go into the government in order to save us from the religious
well,
Zionists.
Gantz is not. It's never been his agenda to see Bibi prosecuted, to see Bibi put in jail or anything like that. That's not
Right.
important to him. And fine, you can make a good case for that, and that if he's disqualified from serving as a leader, that would be enough of a punishment. But I think there's a lot to worry about here.
Now listen to this.